Okay, let's create a new project in Android Studio and learn more about switches. So I launch Android Studio. I create a new project. I name it, for example, Switch, and set the location of my project to the Material Design Projects folder. Next, I set the minimum SDK to API 15 or Android 4. From this list, I select Empty Activity and I click Finish. I wait as Android Studio is creating my project. Alright, my project was created successfully. Now I go to the resource section and inside the layout folder, I open the activity main layout. I go to the text section and I get rid of the default paddings added by Android Studio. Also, I remove this context. This tools is also unnecessary, so I remove it. And I don't need the text view as well. I open the preview pane so that we can see our layout preview. Inside my layout, I'm going to define a SwitchCompat. So I type android.support.version7.widget.switchcompat. Now our SwitchCompat requires a height and a width. In the previous section, I set its height and width to wrap content. As you can see, a SwitchCompat was created under the toolbar. After height and width, I'm going to define an ID. @ID slash, for example, I set its ID to switch_ID. After ID, I define a margin for it, and I set its value to, for example, 16 dp. And after margin, I define a text for it. I enter, for example, switch on, off. I press Alt and return, extract string resource, and OK. Now I run my project as is on emulator so that we can learn a little more about SwitchCompat's features. Okay, our application is launched on the emulator. You see that we have a SwitchCompat under the toolbar, which is in the off state by default. We said that one of the characteristics of SwitchCompats is that they are a good substitute for normal switches, and that they preserve their material appearance and features in Android's below Lollipop. SwitchCompats in principle have the two states of on and off. If we click once on the SwitchCompat, the switch will change to the on state. So I do that. When our switch is in the on state, its color follows color accent. So we can change its color by modifying color accent. In order to prevent our SwitchCompat's color from following our color accent, we must define a new style for our SwitchCompat and manually change the value of the color accent item inside the style. Okay, I stop my emulator. I go to the values folder and I open colors.xml. As I don't want my switch to follow color accent, I will create a new color. I name my color, for example, color switch, and I close the color tag. For its value, I go to material colors and I select, for example, light blue. I copy the color code for A200. I return to Android Studio and paste it inside the color switch tag. So we created a new color and named it color switch and set its value to light blue. Now I close colors.xml and open styles.xml. Inside this file, I'm going to define a new style for my switch. So I open a style tag, give a name to my style, for example, switch theme, and I close my style. Okay, inside my style, I'm going to define a new item. From this list, I type Android : color accent, and I close the item. So what we did was to create a new style and define the color accent item inside the style. For its value, I'm going to enter the color that I created in colors.xml. So I type @color/color switch. You see that Android Studio shows an error message for this item, saying that this item requires API 15 or Android Lollipop. While we have set the minimums decay to API 15. To remove this error, as you know, I'm going to remove the Android : part from the item. You see that the item's error is now gone. Okay, now we are done with styles.xml, so I close this file. I return to my activity main layout and define a theme for my SwitchCompat. After text, I type app : I press Alt and Return to import app to my layout, and I type theme. Now I reference the style that I have created for my switch. @style/switch theme. Now let's run our project on emulator. Alright, our application is launched successfully on the emulator. I'm going to set my switch to the on state, and as you can see, our switch changed its color to light blue. So we defined a new style for our switch, and inside this style we modified the value of the color accent item so that by default our switch color wouldn't follow Android's color accent when it is active. You can define any color that you want for your switch. One thing to note about switches is that a switch is in the off state by default. This means that when our app is run on an Android device, all switches are off by default. We have an attribute which, if set to true, can set the default switch state to on. I stop my emulator, and after theme I type Android:checked. I set the value of this attribute to true. As you can see, our switch changed its state to on in the preview pane. Now I run my project on emulator. Alright, our application is running on the emulator. As you can see, our switch is on by default because we have set the checked attribute to true. Its default value is false, so if we define this attribute and set its value to true, then our switch will be set to the on state by default. I stop my emulator and change this attribute's value from true to false. Okay, that's it for our SwitchCompat. I closed the activity main layout and open the main activity class. Now I want to tell you about SwitchCompat methods. Inside the main activity class, I create an object from the SwitchCompat class. I name my object, for example, SwitchCompat. Inside the onCreate method, I get the reference for my object. SwitchCompat equals, I use casting to cast the return value to SwitchCompat, find view by ID. Inside the parentheses, I enter the ID for my SwitchCompat, r.id.switch_id, and semicolon. I type SwitchCompat dot, and then I call the setUncheckedChangeListener method. Inside the parentheses, I type new UncheckedChangeListener. You see that the UncheckedChange method was created for us. Inside this method, we have a Boolean parameter named b. When we click on our switch, or when we select the switch, the code inside the UncheckedChange method is executed, and also the value of b changes according to the state of our switch. So now inside this method, I type system.out.println and I pass it b. Print for me the value of b. Okay, let's run the project on emulator. Okay, our application was launched on the emulator. I turn on my switch and you can see that the word true was printed for me. This means that the value of b is equal to true. So whenever we change our switch state, the code inside UncheckedChange is executed. And we can examine the value of b to check the switch state as selected by the user. Now if I turn off my switch, you see that the b parameter is false. I turn on the switch, the Boolean value is now true. And I turn it off. Its value now changes to false. I stop my emulator. Now that we know the b parameter, I'm going to define a condition inside the UncheckedChange method. So I type my condition. If the b parameter is true, then do these actions. Otherwise, run this part. If the value of the b Boolean variable was true, which means if our switch was active, then run this code. So you can enter your desired code inside this block. To see if our condition works correctly, I'm going to use a toast message. Toast.makeText. Inside the parentheses, I type getApplicationContext, a comma, double quotes, and I enter the text for the toast. For example, I type switch is on. Now I set the duration for the toast to length long, and then I call .show. I copy this line of code and I place it inside the else block, but I change the toast text from on to off. Now if I run my project on emulator, when I turn on my switch or activate it, we must see a toast message with the text switch is on. And when I turn off or deactivate the switch, a switch is off text must be displayed. So now I run my project on emulator. Our application is running on the emulator. I activate the switch. As we expected, the toast message was displayed and the conditional statement worked. Now I turn off the switch. This time the message switch is off is displayed. Disabling the switch led to the execution of the code inside the else block. You can enter your custom code for the switch inside these blocks. So far, we discussed switches extensively. In the next lecture, we will get output from our project. So, make sure you won't miss the next tutorials.